Tier 1, 9/11. September 11, 2001 started like any other morning, until it turned into one of the worst days in modern history. It felt like something out of a disaster movie, except there was no CGI, no special effects, just real people caught in the middle of the deadliest terrorist attack in history. 19 men, armed with nothing but box cutters and blind fanaticism, hijacked 4 commercial airliners and turned them into weapons. By the time it was over, nearly 3,000 people were dead. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. People assumed it was some kind of freak accident, until 17 minutes later when United Airlines Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower. That's when it became painfully obvious. It wasn't an accident, it was an attack. Panic spread fast. Smoke and fire filled the buildings. People were trapped on upper floors, and then, when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, both towers came crashing down. Lower Manhattan was buried in dust, debris, and a level of chaos nobody was prepared for. Meanwhile, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, causing part of the building to crumble and effectively throwing the entire U.S. military headquarters into crisis mode. The last plane, United Airlines Flight 93, never made it to its target. By then, passengers had heard what was happening and decided they weren't about to be the next headline. They rushed the cockpit, fought the hijackers, and forced the plane down in a Pennsylvania field. Investigators later found out it was likely headed for the White House or the U.S. Capitol. Thanks to those passengers, that attack never happened. The aftermath was brutal. People jumped from burning buildings. First responders ran straight into collapsing skyscrapers, and New York was left covered in a thick layer of dust that stuck around for days. Streets were lined with missing posters put up by thousands of families, hoping for a miracle that never came. Almost immediately, the U.S. declared a war on terror, launched military operations that would drag on for decades, and put Osama bin Laden at the top of its kill list. After a 10-year game of hide-and-seek, Navy SEALs found him in Pakistan and ended things with a bullet. 9/11 changed everything. Air travel, national security, the way people looked at the world. But more than that, it left scars that still haven't healed. Final solution: atrocities. If hell had a blueprint, the Nazis followed it to the letter. The Nazi genocide wasn't just mass murder. It was genocide on an industrial scale, planned with horrifying precision. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically killed 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, about 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. They also targeted other groups they deemed undesirable, including Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, disabled individuals, LGBTQ+ individuals, and political rebels. In total, the Nazis murdered around 11 million people. But they didn't start with gas chambers. It began with discrimination. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and within months, Jewish people were banned from government jobs. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped them of citizenship and made it illegal for Jews and non-Jews to marry. Propaganda painted them as enemies of the state, blaming them for Germany's economic problems. Then came the ghettos, walled-off, overcrowded sections of cities where food was scarce. Disease spread like wildfire, and survival was a coin toss. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest, held over 400,000 people in just 1.3 square miles. Starvation was deliberate, to the point that by 1942, residents were getting less than 200 calories per day. By 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, gave the world a preview of what was coming. Jewish businesses and synagogues were destroyed. People were beaten in the streets, and over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. But even then, most didn't realize how much worse things were going to get. In 1941, the Nazis escalated things. Death squads called the Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into Eastern Europe. They rounded up entire Jewish communities, forced them to dig their own graves, and executed them. More than 1 million people were killed this way. But soon, the Nazis decided bullets were inefficient, so they built the camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor weren't just prisons. They were factories designed to turn human beings into ash. Trains packed with people arrived daily. If you were strong enough to work, you lived a little longer, until exhaustion, starvation, or disease took over. If not, you were sent straight to the gas chambers, where Zyklon B, a pesticide, suffocated entire rooms of people in minutes. The Nazis got so efficient that at Auschwitz alone, 1.1 million people were murdered, most within hours of arrival. In Operation Reinhard that took place between 1942 and 1943, the Nazis built 3 extermination camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Balzak, specifically to kill as many people as possible. Treblinka alone saw over 800,000 deaths, with victims arriving and being gassed within 2 hours. The killing only stopped when the war did. When Allied forces finally reached the camps in 1945, they found starving survivors and mass graves. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops found 60,000 emaciated prisoners and 13,000 unburied corpses. The world had seen war before, but nothing like this. Not too long after, the 1945 Nuremberg trials were set in motion to hold key Nazi officials accountable. But justice could never bring back the millions lost. The Titanic. Back in the day, people thought the Titanic was basically invincible. It was the biggest, fanciest ship around. A full-on floating palace with everything you could ever want. We're talking luxury cabins, a grand staircase, a gym, a swimming pool, even Turkish bath. It even had a wireless system, so passengers could send messages to their friends bragging about how fancy the ship was. The system was pretty much the early 1900s version of free Wi-Fi. In addition to being invincible, the Titanic was also marketed as unsinkable, because history has shown that calling something indestructible always works out well. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic was cruising through the North Atlantic at full speed, on its way from Southampton to New York, when one of the lookouts spotted an iceberg right in its path. First Officer William Murdoch tried to steer around it, but at 11:40 p.m., the ship's starboard side scraped against the ice, tearing open the hull in multiple places. At first, it seemed like maybe things would be okay. They were not. 5 watertight compartments flooded almost instantly, and the ship started sinking fast. Turns out the Titanic was pretty much sinkable. Panic set in as crew members started loading the ship's lifeboats, but there was one massive problem. They didn't have nearly enough. Regulations back then didn't require lifeboats for everyone. So instead of using that deck space for, survival, they probably opted for a giant fancy staircase or something like that. The ship carried just 20 lifeboats when it could have held double that. But back then, lifeboats weren't seen as save-everyone equipment. They were Uberized to the nearest rescue ship. The logic? This thing is unsinkable anyway, so why bother? Needless to say, that was a bad call. The whole women and children first rule, it was enforced, but kind of inconsistently. First-class passengers had a much better shot at making it out, while many third-class passengers were trapped below deck as freezing water poured in. By 2:20 a.m., the Titanic split in half and sank, taking over 1,500 people with it. Most of the people left in the water didn't last long. The ocean was just too cold, among other things. In the end, only a few were rescued. Everyone else vanished into the dark, never to be seen again. The sinking of the Titanic led to a ton of new safety regulations. More lifeboats, mandatory emergency drills, and 24/7 radio monitoring on ships. But none of that could change what happened that night. More than a century later, the Titanic is still one of history's most famous disasters. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima. And just like that, the world got its first real introduction to nuclear weapons, in the worst way possible. The temperature at ground zero shot up to about 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit in an instant, which is the kind of heat that turns people into shadows on the pavement. Buildings crumbled, a shockwave ripped through the city, and a firestorm took care of whatever was left. Almost everything within a mile was flattened, and tens of thousands of people were killed on the spot. For those who survived the initial blast, things didn't get much better. People wandered the streets with their skin peeling off and their eyes swollen shut, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then came the black rain, aka radioactive water mixed with soot, falling from the sky and drenching everyone. If the explosion hadn't killed you, the fallout was happy to give it a shot. And just when Japan was still trying to process all of this, round 2 happened. On August 9, the US dropped another bomb, this time on Nagasaki. If Hiroshima was hell, Nagasaki wasn't much of an improvement. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, wiped out tens of thousands more people in an instant. Radiation sickness kicked in soon after, with survivors losing hair, suffering from internal burns, and dealing with infections no one really knew how to treat. By the time it was all over, somewhere between 150,000 and 246,000 people had died, most of them civilians. But the suffering didn't stop there. The survivors, known as hibakusha, spent the rest of their lives dealing with chronic illness, social stigma, and in some cases, genetic mutations passed down to their kids. Some managed to move on, while others wished they hadn't made it at all. Japan surrendered days after the explosions, bringing World War II to an official end. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only time nuclear weapons have been used in war, and whether they were necessary or just a horrific experiment is still up for debate. But one thing's for sure, humans have a real talent for wiping each other out with maximum efficiency. Chernobyl nuclear disaster. On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union became ground zero for one of the worst disasters in history. Reactor number 4 exploded, sending radioactive material across Europe and turning the city of Pripyat into a ghost town. Everything that went down that day is exactly why Chernobyl is now just another way to say colossal screw-up. So what exactly happened? Well, they were running a test to see if the reactor could power its own cooling system in a blackout. Sounds harmless, right? Except they ran the test while the reactor was unstable. Then, thanks to a major design flaw, trying to shut it down only made things worse. The power spiked, the fuel rods shattered, steam built up faster than you can say bad idea, and then, boom. The reactor lid, a 1,000-ton slab of metal, shot through the roof like a champagne cork, except instead of celebratory bubbles, it released lethal radiation. The initial explosion was bad enough, but that was just the beginning of a series of unfortunate events. A fire broke out in the exposed reactor core, releasing radioactive materials into the atmosphere. Firefighters rushed to the scene, having no clue they were walking straight into a death trap. Most of them didn't have protective gear because they thought they were just dealing with a regular fire, not inhaling lethal doses of radiation. A lot of them died horribly within weeks. Meanwhile, the Soviet government went straight into denial mode. The 49,000 residents of Pripyat just went about their day, completely unaware they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. It wasn't until 36 hours later that they were finally evacuated, by which point the damage was already done. Right after the explosion, 237 plant workers and first responders ended up in the hospital, and 134 of them were diagnosed with acute radiation sickness. Of those, 28 died within months, but the real death toll? That's anyone's guess. Some reports claim fewer than 100 people died directly from the disaster, while others argue that radiation-induced cancers will eventually kill thousands. By 2005, over 6,000 cases of childhood thyroid cancer has already been linked to it. To contain the radiation, the Soviets threw together a concrete sarcophagus around the reactor. But concrete doesn't last forever, so in 2016 they had to slide a massive steel structure over it. And just to put this into perspective, experts are not expecting to finish cleaning up Chernobyl until 2065, because apparently 8 decades is what it takes to fix one really bad day. Rwandan Genocide. In 1994, Rwanda experienced one of the deadliest genocides in modern history. Over a 100-day period, more than 500,000 Tutsi people, and any Hutu or Twa people who tried to help them, were murdered. This wasn't a war or sudden political uprising. It was a well-planned mass killing fueled by years of ethnic tension, propaganda, and leftover colonial divisions. And it all started on April 6th, when Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot down near Kigali. Within hours, Hutu extremists took that as their cue to start killing. Radio stations started broadcasting calls for mass murder like they were announcing a community bake sale. Machetes were the weapon of choice. Cheap, effective, and already lying around in most households. Neighbors turned on each other. Families were wiped out, and even priests and teachers joined in. If you were a Tutsi, there was nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, the rest of the world sat back and did absolutely nothing. The UN had peacekeepers on the ground, but they were given strict orders not to intervene. Western governments, including the US and France, refused to call it a genocide because that would have meant doing something about it. Instead, they tiptoed around the wording while bodies piled up in the streets. The killing finally stopped in July, when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, led by Paul Kagame, fought its way through the country and took control. By then, over 1 million people were dead, and Rwanda was left to figure out how to rebuild from the ashes. And just like that, the world moved on, until the next time it happened somewhere else. The Boston Marathon bombing. The Boston Marathon is supposed to be about endurance, determination, and a whole lot of strangers awkwardly high-fiving each other on the sidelines. But on April 15, 2013, that feel-good energy turned into an absolute shit show when 2 homemade bombs exploded near the finish line. It all happened in seconds. At around 2:49 p.m., as exhausted runners dragged themselves towards the finish line, the first bomb went off on Boylston Street. 14 seconds later, another explosion rocked the street just a block away. In the chaos, 3 people were killed: 29-year-old Crystal Campbell, 23-year-old Ling-Ji Liu, and 8-year-old Martin Richard. On top of that, hundreds were badly injured. Some people even lost limbs. While first responders and bystanders were desperately working to save lives, 2 guys just strolled away from the chaos like they hadn't just blown up the Boston Marathon. Except they had. Those guys were brothers Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. They'd spent months building their bombs, studying Al-Qaeda's greatest hits, and waiting for the perfect moment. They didn't care who they hurt, and they had no plans to stop there. Thankfully, the FBI wasn't about to let that happen. They got to work immediately, and 3 days later, after combing through security footage, they released images of 2 suspects carrying backpacks. The Tsarnaevs realized their time was running out and decided to go full GTA mode. First, they ambushed and killed MIT police officer Sean Collier. Then, they carjacked a man, forced him to withdraw money, and listened to him beg for his life. Their escape plan was pretty simple: orchestrate absolute chaos and then dip. They led police on a high-speed chase through Watertown, chucking homemade grenades out the window like they were in some action movie. Then came the shootout, complete with bullets flying and sirens blazing. Tamerlan got shot multiple times, and in a truly ridiculous twist, his own brother ran him over while trying to escape. That was the end of Tamerlan, but Dzhokhar was still out there. For nearly 24 hours, Boston was in full lockdown mode. SWAT teams patrolled the streets. Helicopters circled overhead, and everyone stayed glued to their TVs. In the middle of all the commotion, a guy in Watertown went out to check his boat, only to find Dzhokhar hiding inside, bleeding and barely conscious. Police arrived at the scene, shots were fired, and just like that, it was over. Dzhokhar was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes. Tier 2. Bosnian Genocide. In the early 1990s, while the world was busy celebrating the end of the Cold War, Bosnia was falling apart. Literally. The breakup of Yugoslavia turned ugly fast, and what followed was one of the worst atrocities of the century: the Bosnian Genocide. The term ethnic cleansing stopped being just something from history books. It was happening in real time. The army of Republika Srpska, led by General Ratko Mladic, made it their mission to wipe out Bosniak Muslims through mass executions, forced deportations, and good old-fashioned brutality. The worst of it came in July 1995 with the Srebrenica massacre. The United Nations had declared Srebrenica a safe zone, but that didn't stop the VRS from rolling in, rounding up over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, and executing them in cold blood. Women and children were packed onto buses and deported, while mass graves filled up with bodies. And that was just one event. Across Bosnia, entire towns were emptied. People were thrown into concentration camps, and assault was used as a weapon of war. If you weren't murdered, you were forced to flee. Thousands of people became refugees overnight. Years later, the world finally called it what it was: genocide. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia handed down life sentences to several high-ranking officials, including Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic. Justice came, eventually. But for thousands of families, the damage was already done. Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. January 28, 1986 was supposed to be a historic day, until it wasn't. A space shuttle launch is always a big deal, but this one had something extra: a schoolteacher on board. Trista McAuliffe, a regular civilian, was about to go to space, live out every kid's dream, and prove that astronauts weren't just people with PhDs in rocket science. Schools across the US tuned in, ready to watch history unfold. And history did unfold, just not in the way anyone expected. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger was gone. One moment, it was soaring into the sky, leaving behind a bright white column of smoke. The next, a horrific Y-shaped explosion ripped it apart, 46,000 feet above the Atlantic. Pieces of the shuttle spiraled down in slow motion, while millions of people, many of them school children, watched live. For a moment, the nation held its breath, waiting, hoping. Maybe the crew had escaped somehow. Maybe there was a backup plan, but there wasn't. And here's the part that still stings. NASA had known about the problem for years. The culprit? The O-rings. Small rubber seals in the rocket boosters that were supposed to keep hot gases contained. In cold weather, they stiffened and became brittle. Not exactly ideal when you're dealing with literal rocket fuel. The night before the launch, Florida's temperatures dropped to record lows. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, panicked. They spoke up and made it clear that the O-rings could fail. But NASA, under pressure to meet deadlines, gave them the green light anyway. And fail they did. The O-rings stiffened, the seals broke, and superheated gas leaked out, burning through the side of the right booster like a blowtorch. Challenger never stood a chance. And here's the worst part. Some of the crew probably survived the initial explosion. The orbiter didn't just vanish. The crew cabin detached and free fell for over 2 minutes before slamming into the ocean. Whether they lost consciousness before impact is unknown, but when that compartment hit the water at terminal velocity, survival was impossible. The fallout was massive. NASA's shuttle program was shut down for 32 months. Investigations revealed not just faulty O-rings, but a whole culture of ignoring engineers when they raised red flags. 7 people died because no one wanted to delay a launch. In response to all the backlash, NASA overhauled its safety protocols, redesigned the boosters, and promised to do better. But the damage was already done. Fukushima Disaster. On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake hit off Japan's coast, cracking roads like cheap pottery and making skyscrapers sway like they'd had one too many. But that was just the warm-up act. The real nightmare came next. A 40-foot tsunami barreling toward Japan like it had a score to settle, and right in its path was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Now, nuclear power plants are supposed to handle bad days. They've got backup systems on top of backup systems. But when nature decides to throw hands, none of that really matters. First, the earthquake knocked out the main power. No big deal. The emergency generators kicked in. Then, the tsunami arrived and drowned the generators. And just like that, the plant lost its ability to cool its reactors. What followed was a slow-motion train wreck. The cooling systems failed, pressure built up, and radioactive steam had nowhere to go. Desperate to avoid an outright explosion, workers vented the radioactive gas straight into the atmosphere. But that wasn't enough. Then, boom. Hydrogen built up, and Reactor 1 exploded. Then, Reactor 3. Then, Reactor 4. It was like a nuclear-themed fireworks show, except nobody was celebrating. Radiation leaked into the air, the water, and the soil, making this the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Panic set in fast. The government ordered evacuations. First a 2-kilometer zone, then 3, then 10, then 20. It was like a terrible game of musical chairs, except the prize was not getting radiation poisoning. Over 160,000 people were displaced, and at least 51 died in the chaos of the evacuation itself. Meanwhile, officials downplayed the meltdown. TEPCO, the power company, got caught hiding information, and a lot of people found out that they had to leave town from the news, not the government. When the dust settled, well, the radioactive dust, the disaster left Japan with a $180 billion cleanup bill, and a nuclear ghost town that's still empty today. Bhopal Gas. It was just another night in Bhopal, India, until an invisible killer seeped into the air and turned the city into a gas chamber. On December 3, 1984, 500,000 people found themselves choking on methyl isocyanate or MIC gas, courtesy of a leak from a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide India Limited. The factory was supposed to protect crops, but instead it wiped out humans. The death toll was staggering. Officially, 2,259 people died on the spot. Unofficially, no one really knows. Some estimates say up to 8,000 people were gone within 2 weeks, and over 500,000 were exposed, many of whom were left with permanent damage. It was the worst industrial disaster in history, and the nightmare didn't end when the gas cleared. Over the years, another 8,000 people are believed to have died from gas-related illnesses that tore their bodies apart from the inside. So what did Union Carbide do in the middle of all this chaos? Exactly what every guilty corporation does when things go south. Lawyer up. Pay up. In this case, it was $470 million settlement in 1989. And get the hell out. By 1994, Union Carbide had washed its hands of the whole thing, selling off its stake in the company. By 2001, Dow Chemical swooped in and took over. Meanwhile, the abandoned plant was left to rot, still leaking poison into the soil and water. No one had cleaned it up. No one took responsibility. Union Carbide CEO at the time, Warren Anderson, was charged with manslaughter in India, but never set foot in an Indian courtroom. 7 Indian executives from the company got 2 years in prison and a $2,000 fine. Basically, a slap on the wrist. They barely had time to pack a toothbrush before they were out on bail. And here's the worst part. This wasn't even an accident. The factory had a long history of leaks, and its safety systems were a total joke. The refrigeration unit meant to keep MIC stable, shut down. The vent gas scrubber, useless. The flare tower that should have burned off excess gas, out of order. It was like storing dynamite next to a bonfire and crossing your fingers. On the day of the leak, water got into tank E610 and triggered a chemical reaction. With the safety systems out of commission, there was nothing anyone could do to stop the gas from pouring out. Workers who were on site tried to sound the alarm, but by the time management realized this wasn't just a minor leak, it was already too late. Within an hour, 30 to 40 tons of MIC had spread through the city. People woke up coughing, vomiting, and gasping for air as their lungs filled with fluid. Some died in their sleep. Others ran blindly through the streets, only to collapse where they stood. Entire families were wiped out in a single night. Decades later, Bhopal is still suffering. The soil and water remain contaminated. Children are born with defects, and survivors continue to battle diseases from that night. The disaster may have happened in 1984, but for the people of Bhopal, it never really ended. Columbine Shooting. April 20th, 1999, started like any other Tuesday in Littleton, Colorado, until 2 teenagers decided to turn their high school into a war zone. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold had been planning their attack for over a year. The plan was simple. Plant 2 propane bombs in the cafeteria, set them to explode during the busiest lunch period, and gun down anyone who tried to escape. Then they'd pick off survivors outside while waiting for secondary car bombs to take out first responders. But the bombs never went off. When the killer duo realized their homemade explosives had failed, they moved on to Plan B, grabbing their guns and shooting everyone in sight. At 11:19 a.m., they made their move. The first victims, Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo, were sitting outside when the gunfire began. Rachel died instantly. Richard survived, but was left paralyzed. From there, Harris and Klebold moved towards the school entrance, firing at anyone who crossed their path. Panic spread quickly as teachers and students realized this wasn't a prank or a drill. Kids hid under desks, locked themselves in classrooms, and called 911. Meanwhile, Harris and Klebold moved through the school, laughing, taunting, and shooting. The library saw the worst of it. 10 students were executed while hiding under desks. By the time it was over, 13 people, 12 students, and a teacher were dead. At 12:08 p.m., Harris and Klebold took their own lives. Then came the questions. How did this happen? Why did it happen? And most importantly, who was to blame? The media pointed fingers at violent video games, goth culture, bullying, antidepressants, and even the internet. Everyone was looking for an explanation, but the truth was messier than any single cause. The police response to the situation was yet another disaster. Officers stayed outside for most of the attack, afraid to go in because they thought there were explosives. That hesitation cost lives and forced law enforcement to completely rethink how they handle active shooter situations. The old waited-out approach was scrapped in favor of immediate action, something that's now standard procedure. But here's the most disturbing part. Columbine didn't just change school security. It became a blueprint for future shooters. The Columbine effect set off a wave of copycats who saw Harris and Klebold as twisted role models. Holodomor. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union decided to crank up its industrialization efforts, and Ukraine got the short end of the stick. By that, I mean millions of people starved to death because of politics. This wasn't incompetence. This was famine as a policy decision. Death by bureaucracy on a national scale. Holodomor, as it's now called, hit Soviet Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. Joseph Stalin was determined to squeeze as much grain as possible out of Ukraine to fuel his industrial plants. The catch? He took so much that the people who actually grew the food had nothing left to eat. Soviet authorities imposed absurd grain quotas, demanding farmers hand over almost everything they produced. If they tried to keep even a handful, they were branded thieves and either executed or shipped off to the gulag. Meanwhile, warehouses were packed with grain, rotting away while entire villages starved. Then came the infamous Law of Spikeletts, which made picking leftover grains from harvested fields a crime. Over 200,000 starving people were arrested for essentially trying not to die. And to really drive the point home, the Soviet Union blacklisted entire villages that didn't meet their quotas, cutting off all food and supplies. As if that wasn't bad enough, Soviet authorities also made sure people couldn't escape. They blocked roads, required internal passports to travel, and sent anyone caught fleeing back to their doomed villages. Around 150,000 people died just trying to get out. And the rest of the world barely noticed. The Soviet Union covered it up so well that for decades, hardly anyone outside Ukraine knew it ever happened. It wasn't until the 1980s, when glasnost loosened the grip on Soviet history, that the full extent of Holodomor came to light. Today, many countries recognize it as a genocide, though some still argue over whether it was intentional. But here's what isn't up for debate. Millions of people died in one of the worst man-made famines in history. Tier 3. Sandy Hook Shooting. December 14th, 2012 started like any other school day at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newton, Connecticut. Kids were in their classrooms, teachers were settling in, and everything felt normal. Then, gunfire shattered the routine, and in minutes, the school became the site of one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. The shooter was 20-year-old Adam Lanza, a deeply disturbed man who had already begun his killing spree before even leaving home. That morning, he shot his mother 4 times in the head while she slept, stole her car, grabbed her illegally purchased guns, and drove to Sandy Hook. By the time he arrived, he was armed with a Bushmaster XM15 E2S rifle, 2 handguns, and enough ammo to wipe out an entire school. Sandy Hook had security measures. Doors locked after 9:30 a.m., and visitors were to be screened by a camera system. But locked doors don't do much against a guy with a rifle. Lanza shot through a glass panel near the entrance and walked right in. The first people in his path were Principal Don Hochsprung and school psychologist Mary Sherlach. Lanza shot them both instantly. Then he kept moving, firing at anything in his way. Lanza's first stop was room 8. Before he got there, Lauren Russo, the substitute teacher who was in charge that day, had packed her first graders into a bathroom, hoping to keep them safe. But it didn't matter. Lanza forced his way and started shooting. In seconds, 15 kids and 2 teachers were dead. The only survivor was a 6-year-old girl who played dead. Next was room 10, Victoria Soto. The teacher in charge had hidden her students in a closet, but Lanza found some of them, including a 6-year-old boy. By the time the police arrived, it was already over. Lanza had killed 20 children and 6 staff members before turning the gun on himself. Investigators searched for answers but found no clear motive. Just a deeply troubled man with an obsession with mass shootings and easy access to deadly weapons. Las Vegas shooting. October 1st, 2017 was supposed to be a night of country music, cold beers, and questionable dance moves. The Route 91 Harvest Festival was wrapping up, but then at 10:05 p.m., rapid gunfire rained down on the crowd from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel. Some thought it was fireworks until people started dropping. The shooter, 64-year-old Stephen Paddock, had spent days turning his hotel suite into a sniper's nest. He had hauled in 24 guns, thousands of rounds of ammo, and high-capacity magazines, all legally purchased because, well, America. And in around 10 minutes, he unloaded more than 1,000 rounds into the helpless crowd below. People ran in every direction. Others dropped to the ground, frozen in disbelief. Off-duty cops in the crowd tried to protect their families, but with the shots raining from above, there was no clear way to fight back. 911 calls poured in, but in all the panic, no one knew where the shots were coming from. Inside the hotel, a security guard named Jesus Campos was the first to cross Paddock's path, taking a bullet to the leg through the door. Despite his injury, he managed to radio for help. But by the time SWAT stormed the room at 11:20 p.m., Paddock was already dead from a self-inflicted gunshot. No manifesto, no note, no demands. Just a room full of spent casings, weapons, and security cameras he had set up to watch the hallway. In the end, 60 people were killed. Over 400 were wounded by gunfire, and hundreds more were injured in the chaos. It remains the deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history. And despite the investigations, the endless theories, and the debates that followed, nobody knows why he did it. Deepwater Oil Spill. On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig went from an engineering marvel to a $1 million Molotov cocktail floating in the Gulf of Mexico. A high-pressure surge of methane shot up the drill pipe, set off an explosion, and turned the rig into a raging inferno. 11 crew members vanished in the chaos. Their bodies never recovered. While survivors barely escaped with their lives as their workplace literally burned around them, 2 days later, the entire rig collapsed into the sea. And BP, who had spent years cutting safety costs to maximize profits, was now responsible for the worst oil spill in human history. At the seafloor, the busted wellhead basically turned into an out-of-control oil geyser, spewing crude at an insane rate of 62,000 barrels per day. BP struggled for 87 days to contain the spill, during which an estimated 3.9 million barrels of oil flooded the ocean. A thick, black tide spread across 70,000 square miles, choking out everything in its path. The beaches in the area turned into oil-soaked wastelands, and the whole place smelled like chemicals and rotting fish. The cleanup was a mess. Skimmer ships, controlled burns, and 1.84 million gallons of chemical dispersants were dumped into the water in a desperate attempt to fight the spill. But it was like trying to clean up a flood with a handful of napkins. Eventually, oil washed up along the coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, turning shorelines into mass graves for anything that used to swim. Dolphins, turtles, fish, you name it. When investigators started digging, they found exactly what everyone expected: corporate greed, rushed decisions, and outright negligence. BP, Transocean, the rig operator, and Halliburton, the contractor, had all ignored safety warnings and cut corners to save a few bucks. Faulty cement sealing, misread pressure tests, and a culture of saying, it'll be fine in the face of dangerous situations all led to disaster. BP's own engineers had flagged issues months before the disaster, but fixing them would have cost millions, and BP wasn't about to let safety get in the way of shareholder profits. BP ended up facing criminal charges and pled guilty to 11 counts of manslaughter, among other violations. The financial fallout was brutal. Over $65 billion in cleanup costs, settlements, and fines, including a record $20.8 billion environmental damage settlement. But no amount of money could undo the mess they left behind. Hindenburg Disaster. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg, a massive German airship, went up in flames over Lakehurst, New Jersey, bringing a dramatic and a very public end to the era of passenger airships. Imagine a flying luxury hotel, but instead of champagne and peanuts, you're sitting inside a balloon filled with explosive gas. The Hindenburg was a zeppelin the size of the Titanic, powered by enough hydrogen to turn New Jersey into barbecue. And in less than a minute, that's exactly what happened. The most ironic part? They originally wanted to use helium, but the US said, "Nope, that's ours." So Germany went with hydrogen instead. Because what could possibly go wrong? The thing was a 245-meter long flying cruise ship filled with 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen, which in hindsight was like storing fireworks in a gas station. It had made plenty of successful trips before, carrying wealthy passengers across the Atlantic in style. But on this particular evening, things took a hard turn. After a 3-day trip from Frankfurt, the Hindenburg was making its final approach to dock. Eyewitnesses weren't sure exactly where it started, but they all agreed on one thing. Once the flames became visible, it was game over. Within seconds, the fire tore through the hydrogen-filled frame, turning the Hindenburg into a giant fireball. The tail dropped, the nose shot up, and the whole structure crumpled like a burning soda can. Passengers and crew members had little time to react. Some jumped from terrifying heights, while others held on, hoping for the best. Onlookers, who had gathered expecting a smooth landing, instead got an unexpected front row seat to a disaster. By the time the flames died down, 35 people on board were dead, along with one unlucky ground worker, and the whole thing was caught on film. Just like that, the golden age of airships crashed and burned. Literally. Exxon Valdez oil spill. At 12:04 a.m. on March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker slammed into Blee Reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound, and everything went to hell. Over 10 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the ocean, slowly oozing out while the wrecked tanker sat there like a beached whale, leaking poison into one of the most pristine ecosystems on the planet. Prince William Sound, once home to thriving wildlife, became an oil-slicked graveyard. Seabirds that were supposed to be soaring through the sky flapped uselessly because their feathers were now glued together with a tar. Otters, usually known for floating around carefree, sank under the suffocating film. The coastline, all 1,300 miles of it, was transformed into a blackened wasteland. So how did this happen? Well, the headlines pointed straight at Captain Joseph Hazelwood, painting him as the drunk at the wheel who destroyed an entire ecosystem. But the truth was a bit messier. Hazelwood wasn't even on the bridge when the ship hit the reef. He'd handed over control to his third mate, Gregory Cousins, who had been working way too long and was barely functioning. On top of that, Exxon's cost-cutting had left the crew exhausted. And to make things worse, the ship's radar, the thing that might have helped them avoid the reef, had been broken for over a year. Fixing it was apparently too expensive. When the hull tore open, oil poured out at an alarming speed, 5.8 million gallons in just 3 hours. To make matters worse, Exxon's response was slow, uncoordinated, and basically useless. By the time they got serious about cleanup, storms had already spread the slick everywhere. Booms didn't contain it, skimmers barely made a dent, and dispersants just turned one problem into another. In the end, they managed to recover only about 10% of the oil, which is a generous way of saying not much at all. Exxon eventually apologized with billions in fines, settlements, and cleanup costs. But money doesn't erase oil-soaked beaches or bring back dead wildlife. Even decades later, if you dig deep enough into Alaskan sand, you'll probably still find pockets of oil. The ecosystem never fully recovered, and Prince William Sound is still paying the price for one very expensive mistake. Tier 4. Halifax Explosion. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the people of Halifax were going about their usual routine, no different from any other day. People were heading to work, kids were getting ready for school, same old, same old. Nobody had the slightest clue that their city was about to be blown to pieces by the biggest human-made explosion in history. Well, at least until nuclear bombs showed up and said, "Hold my beer." It all started with a seemingly minor screw-up in Halifax Harbor. The SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship packed to the brim with explosives, crossed paths with the SS Imo, a Norwegian relief vessel. They were both trying to navigate the crowded waterway when they collided. It wasn't a high-speed crash, more like a slow, awkward fender bender. Under normal circumstances, this kind of crash would have just led to some yelling, a mountain of paperwork, and a couple of very stressed-out captains. But the Mont Blanc wasn't carrying normal cargo. It was basically a floating bomb. The ship was packed with TNT, picric acid, and benzol, a fuel so flammable it might as well burst into flames if you gave it a dirty look. When the ships collided, sparks flew, benzol started leaking, and within minutes, the deck was an inferno. That's just a really fancy way of saying the thing caught fire. Moments later, a thick column of black smoke started rising into the sky. People in Halifax, curious about the commotion, dropped what they were doing to check it out. Some even wandered down to the water for a better view, without realizing they just picked the worst possible place to stand. The only ones who really knew what was about to happen were the Mont Blanc's crew. They knew exactly what was coming, so they ditched the ship and rowed away like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The crew members shouted warnings as they neared the shore, but with all the chaos, nobody heard a thing. 20 minutes later, at precisely 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. And when it did, it turned downtown Halifax into a war zone. The blast was the equivalent of 2.9 kilotons of TNT, which is about 1/5 the power of the Hiroshima bomb. And to make matters worse, it was centered right in the middle of a busy city. Everything within 800 meters of the explosion was wiped off the map. A pressure wave tore through the streets, flattening buildings, snapping trees, and tossing rail cars like they were paper. Anyone unfortunate enough to be within the area didn't fare much better than the rail cars. The shockwave from the explosion shattered windows for miles. In Halifax's north end, entire neighborhoods were leveled. Across the harbor in Dartmouth, the explosion triggered a tsunami that completely wiped out the Mi'kmaq community that had been there for generations. By the time the dust settled, at least 1,782 people were dead, and over 9,000 were injured. Many blinded by flying glass, burned by fires, or trapped under collapsed buildings. As if things weren't already bad enough, a snowstorm rolled in the next day, making rescue efforts even harder. A judicial inquiry originally blamed Mont Blanc for the disaster, but later appeals spread the responsibility between both ships. Regardless of who was officially at fault, the outcome was the same. Halifax had just experienced one of the deadliest explosions in history. Today, the city remembers the tragedy with memorials placed throughout the area. Texas City Disaster. On a quiet April morning in 1947, in the industrial port in Galveston Bay, Texas got a front row seat to one of the worst explosions in U.S. history. It all started with a small fire aboard the SS Grand Camp, a French cargo ship packed with 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, a chemical used in both fertilizer and explosives. So, totally safe. At 8:30 a.m., workers noticed smoke sneaking out of the cargo hold. They tried to put it out, but the fire wasn't having it. That's when the ship's captain made the choice that would go down in the Hall of Fame for bad decisions. Instead of using water, he ordered the hold to be sealed and flooded with steam, hoping to smother the flames. Problem is, ammonium nitrate doesn't need oxygen to burn. In fact, heating it just speeds its transformation into pure explosive fury. In the captain's defense, he just didn't want to damage precious cargo. In a matter of minutes, the pressure inside the ship built up. The hatches blew off, and a thick column of bright orange smoke poured into the city. Basically a giant neon sign screaming, "Get the hell out of here." But no one really listened. At 9:12 a.m., the Grand Camp detonated in a blast so massive, it wiped out everything within 2,000 feet. The blast sent a 15-foot tsunami tearing through the harbor, flattened buildings, and launched a shockwave that shattered windows in Galveston up to 8 miles away. The Monsanto Chemical Company, packed with 450 workers that morning, was obliterated. Almost a third of its employees died instantly. Meanwhile, flaming debris and chunks of molten metal rained from the sky. The ship's 2-ton anchor was found over a mile away from the explosion site. The blast also took out most of Texas City's volunteer firefighters, who had rushed in without realizing they were standing on top of a ticking time bomb. And somehow, the nightmare still wasn't over. Another cargo ship nearby, the SS High Flyer, had also caught fire. This one was carrying 961 tons of ammonium nitrate and 1,800 tons of sulfur. Because why stop at one chemical disaster when you can have two? Officials tried to move the ship before it blew, but their attempts failed. At 1:10 a.m. the next day, the High Flyer went off, leveling what was left of the port. Fires raged for days, wiping out oil refineries, chemical plants, and entire neighborhoods. By the time it was over, more than 500 buildings were destroyed, over 5,000 people were injured, and at least 581 were dead, though many believe that the actual number was probably much higher. Darfur Genocide. The Darfur Genocide wasn't just a war. It was a government-backed extermination campaign that turned entire communities into targets. It kicked off in 2003, when rebel groups in Sudan's Darfur region got tired of being ignored and took up arms against the government, demanding fair treatment. Instead of just dealing with the rebels, the Sudanese government thought, why not go all in? So they armed a bunch of ruthless militias known as the Janjaweed. Oh, and by the way, the Janjaweed literally translates to devils on horseback. Subtle. Over the years, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people were killed. Entire villages were burned down, and about 2.7 million civilians were forced to flee their homes. The attacks followed a horrifyingly predictable pattern. The Janjaweed would roll in, kill all the men and boys, and then subject women and girls to unspeakable violence. Survivors told stories of entire families being wiped out, children murdered in front of their parents, and bodies left mutilated in the streets. It was ethnic cleansing in the most literal sense. At first, the international community acted like it didn't see what was happening. But the scale of the atrocities eventually made that impossible. By 2004, reports from Human Rights Watch and the BBC forced world leaders to acknowledge that this was indeed a full-blown genocide. The International Criminal Court even issued arrest warrants for Sudanese officials, including President Omar al-Bashir, charging them with genocide and crimes against humanity. Of course, getting a dictator to actually show up for court is a whole other problem. The United Nations eventually deployed a joint African Union peacekeeping mission to try and protect civilians and deliver aid. They did what they could, but between the lack of resources and the Sudanese government being openly hostile to outside help, there was only so much they could do. Billions were spent on peacekeeping, and while the violence eventually slowed down by 2018, Darfur was left in ruins. Lac-Mégantic rail disaster. On the night of July 6, 2013, the biggest thing people in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec should have been worrying about was mosquitoes. Not a flaming train plowing through their town. But at 1:14 a.m., a runaway freight train carrying highly flammable crude oil turned into a 73-car ticking time bomb, and there was no stopping it. The train belonged to a company that treated safety regulations more like suggestions than rules. It had been left unattended on a hill, barely held in place by an insufficient number of handbrakes, and was parked on tracks that looked like they were being held together by wishful thinking. A catastrophe waiting to happen. Originally stationed in nearby Nantes, the train's lead locomotive had caught fire earlier that night, because in true corporate fashion, its engine repairs had been more cost-effective than functional. Firefighters put out the blaze, but in doing so, they shut off the engine. Problem? That engine powered the braking system. Once the air pressure started dropping, so did the train's ability to stay put. Slowly, it started rolling. Then it picked up speed, and before anyone could do anything, it was hurtling towards Lac-Mégantic with no crew on board and no failsafe to stop it. People in town saw the train coming even though its lights were off. At 1:14 a.m., it hit a curve in the downtown area, and physics did exactly what you'd expect. Several tank cars derailed, ruptured, and within seconds, the town was consumed by a massive explosion. The explosion was so massive it could be seen from miles away. 47 people, many enjoying a night out at a bar, never had a chance to escape. The fire burned for days, leaving behind a wasteland where homes and businesses once stood. More than 30 buildings were reduced to rubble, and the ones still standing had to be demolished because of contamination. When investigators started digging through the wreckage, they found what can only be described as a beginner's guide to corporate negligence. The train had been running with a single operator as part of a cost-cutting measure. The tracks were in such bad shape that speed restrictions were already in place for large sections. And the tank cars, they were the infamous DOT 111 models, which had a long history of splitting open in crashes. None of this was new information to regulators. They'd been warning about these risks for years, but thanks to industry lobbying, safety upgrades kept getting postponed. It took one of Canada's deadliest train disasters to finally force change. But for 47 people, that change came far too late. Tier 5. Aberfan Disaster. On the morning of October 21, 1966, the people of Aberfan, Wales were going about their day like any other. Kids grabbed their school bags, parents headed to work, and nobody knew that a giant pile of coal waste sitting on the hill above them was about to come crashing down. For weeks, this heap of mining sludge, known as Tip 7, had been soaking up rain like a sponge. And that morning, it finally gave in. The whole thing turned to liquid and came roaring down the hill, straight toward the village. At 9:15 a.m., it slammed into Pantglass Junior School, where kids had just sat down for their lessons. They didn't stand a chance. The classrooms were buried in seconds. Survivors later said it sounded like a jet engine before everything went dark. People ran to help, digging through the sludge with their bare hands, but it was too late for most. In the end, 116 children and 28 adults were killed. A whole generation of kids, gone in minutes. And the worst part, this wasn't some freak accident. Locals had been warning for ages that the coal tip wasn't stable. The National Coal Board knew about the risks but didn't do a thing. When the government investigated, the blame was put on the NCB. But nothing really happened. No one was charged, no fines were given, and the chairman, Lord Robbins, even tried to claim nobody could have seen this coming, despite years of warnings. So yeah, this wasn't just a disaster. It was a mess that could have been avoided if the people in charge had actually listened. The Great Fire of London. London in 1666 was basically a fire hazard waiting to happen. The city was a cramped mess of wooden buildings jammed so close together that you could practically borrow sugar from your neighbor without leaving your house. People were cooking over open flames, throwing fire safety out the window, and generally ignoring every warning King Charles II had ever given about the whole not burning the city down thing. So when a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the middle of the night on September 2nd, the city didn't stand a chance. The baker, Thomas Fariner, and his family managed to escape through an upstairs window. Everyone except the maid, who was too scared to climb out and ended up becoming the fire's first victim. Neighbors tried to put out the flames, but this wasn't just some kitchen fire. The blaze spread fast, tearing through nearby buildings like they were kindling. Because, well, they were. Within hours, it had reached the warehouses by the Thames, who were packed with flammable materials like tar, oil, and hemp. Normally, the river was a handy source of water for firefighting, but at that point, it was just fuel for the inferno. Back then, the city's best fire strategy was demolishing buildings to create fire breaks. But Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, who had the final say on these things, took one look at the flames and reportedly said, "A woman might piss it out." Then he walked away. By the time the authorities actually started tearing buildings down, the fire had already gone full disaster mode. By Monday, the city was in chaos. Rumors started flying that the fire was actually a foreign attack, and before long, mobs were out in the streets attacking immigrants. Because apparently, when in doubt, blame the Dutch or the French. By Tuesday, even St. Paul's Cathedral, a massive stone structure people thought was fireproof, was reduced to rubble. The heat got so intense that it melted lead and caused streams of molten metal to flow down the streets. The fire finally stopped thanks to a mix of sheer luck and last-minute desperation. The wind that had been fanning the flames died down, and soldiers at the Tower of London started blowing up buildings with gunpowder to create real fire breaks. After 4 days of destruction, the flames were finally out. In the end, about 80% of the city inside the old Roman walls was wiped out. But the official death toll was surprisingly low. Only a handful of deaths were recorded, though a lot of people suspect the real number was much higher, especially since poor and homeless victims wouldn't have been counted. Afterward, London had to be almost entirely rebuilt, this time with wider streets, better urban planning, and most importantly, actual fire regulations. Minamata Disease. In 1956, people in the fishing town of Minamata, Japan, started coming down with a strange illness. At first, it looked like something out of a horror movie. People stumbling like they were drunk, hands and feet refusing to work properly, vision going blurry, that sort of thing. Some people couldn't speak, others had violent seizures, and in the worst cases, they slipped into a coma and died. Doctors had no idea what was going on. They thought it might be some kind of contagious disease, so they started isolating patients and disinfecting homes. But that didn't stop it. And then, someone noticed something weird. The cats. For years, locals had watched their cats go nuts, twitching and convulsing before dropping dead. They even had a name for it, dancing cat fever. And it wasn't just the cats. Birds were falling out of the sky. Fish were washing up dead. And Minamata Bay, the town's main source of seafood, was turning into a toxic wasteland. Scientists from the Kumamoto University started digging into the problem and quickly found a pattern. Every single person who got sick had eaten seafood from the bay. The cause? Methylmercury poisoning. And the culprit? The Chiso Corporation. For decades, Chiso had been dumping mercury-laced industrial waste straight into the water, poisoning the fish and, in turn, the people who ate them. And here's the kicker. Both the company and local officials knew something was wrong, but they covered it up. Chiso kept polluting and people kept getting sick. By the time the truth came out, it was too late. Thousands had been poisoned. Children were being born with severe disabilities, and entire families were left to deal with the fallout. Lawsuits eventually forced Chiso to cough up millions in compensation, but no amount of money could fix the damage. Minamata wasn't just a disaster. It was a brutal reminder of what happens when profits come before people. Tenerife Airport Disaster. The deadliest aviation disaster in history started with a bomb threat. March 27, 1977. 2 fully loaded Boeing 747s, one from KLM, one from Pan Am, ended up at Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife. Neither of them was supposed to be there, but a bomb explosion at their original destination forced them to land at this tiny, overworked airport instead. That day, Los Rodeos was drowning in thick fog. Visibility was so bad that air traffic control had to guide pilots using radio instructions alone. Yeah, they were playing verbal charades with two massive planes. KLM Flight 4805, captained by Jacob Van Zanten, had just finished refueling and was eager to get going. Meanwhile, Pan Am Flight 1736, commanded by Victor Grubbs, was still taxiing down the same runway, trying to find the right exit. The problem was that they weren't entirely sure where they were, and neither was air traffic control. Then came the fatal misunderstanding. KLM's crew somehow thought they'd been cleared for takeoff. They hadn't, but Van Zanten hit the throttle anyway, sending his 747 barreling down the runway, right toward the still-moving Pan Am jet. By the time both crews saw each other, there was no time to stop. Grubbs swerved left, trying to avoid impact, while Van Zanten tried his best to lift off early. It didn't work. The KLM's jet undercarriage tore through the top of the Pan Am plane, ripping it apart and scattering flaming wreckage everywhere. KLM, fully loaded with fuel, exploded on impact, killing all 248 people on board. On the Pan Am flight, passengers scrambled to escape. Miraculously, 61 people, mostly those sitting near the front, managed to get out before the fire consumed everything. The other 335 weren't so lucky. Investigators found that poor visibility, miscommunication, and KLM's premature takeoff were to blame. The airline ultimately accepted full responsibility. The disaster led to huge changes in aviation, including stricter cockpit communication rules and standardized radio phraseology, so pilots and air traffic controllers never have to guess what the other is saying again. That's all the devastating tragedies we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hey, by the way, I've been seeing a lot of comments saying I'm an AI voice, but can an AI voice do this? Honestly, naiinis na ako na ang dami nagsasabi na AI voice ako. What the hell, bruh? Pero wala tayong magagawa. Mukhang yung boses ko sobrang pulido ba para sa inyo? Just messing with you. I am not an AI, and I hope this is enough proof. Or maybe tell me what you'd like me to say out loud for the next outro, if that helps.